At 47, Cleo Higgins had buried her heart alongside her deceitful late husband. Her dry goods store was her sanctuary until a towering, blood-stained mountain man shattered her quiet life. He brought Pelt's untamed danger and a desperate secret that would force Cleo to risk absolutely everything. Cleo Higgins stood on the wooden boardwalk of Oak Haven, Colorado, a broom in her calloused hands, watching the late November sky bruise into a deep, violent purple. The year was 1887. At 47, Cleo felt much like the weathered oak beams supporting her mercantile sturdy, worn by the harsh elements and utterly invisible to the passing world. She had given up on the foolish notion of love a decade ago. Her late husband, Josiah, had been a charmer with a smile that could melt winter ice, but he had also been a gambler who left her with a mountain of debt and a heart turned to stone. For 10 years, Cleo had worked her fingers to the bone-selling flower nails, calico, and medicinal tonics, finally claiming the deed to the shop as her own. The silver framing her temples was a hard-won badge of independence. She didn't need a man. She barely even wanted company. "Storm's coming in fierce, Cleo," called out Henrietta Potts, the town's chief busybody, who was clutching her shawl against the biting wind. "Them wild trappers from the ridge will be coming down to drink themselves a blind. Best lock your doors early." "I can handle a few dusty trappers, Etta," Cleo replied, her voice smooth and dry. "My ledger doesn't care if a man smells like pine tar or bay rum, so long as his coin is good." But as the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall, turning the muddy main street of Oak Haven into a frozen wasteland, Cleo hurried inside. She locked the heavy oak door, stoked the potbelly stove until it glowed a dull, angry orange, and began to inventory a new crate of coffee beans. The rich, earthy smell filled the room, mixing with the scent of dried lavender and oiled leather. She was just wiping down the mahogany counter when the front door rattled violently. Cleo froze. She hadn't thrown the deadbolt yet. The door burst open, carried by a howling gust of wind and snow, and a man stepped over the threshold. He was massive, easily 6'4", his shoulders filling the doorframe. He wore a heavy coat of patched buffalo hide, thick leather gloves, and a wide-brimmed felt hat pulled low over his eyes. Snow clung to his thick, dark beard, which was streaked with early grey. He looked less like a man, and more like a force of nature that had mistakenly wandered indoors. But it wasn't his size that made Cleo reach beneath the counter for the cold iron of her Colt revolver. It was the way he was leaning heavily against the doorframe, a ragged, wet breath rattling in his chest, and the dark crimson stain spreading rapidly across the side of his heavy leather coat. He closed the door behind him with a heavy thud, shutting out the howling storm. The silence in the shop was deafening, save for the crackle of the stove and his labored breathing. "Shop's closed," Cleo said, her voice steady, though her hand gripped the pistol tight. The stranger didn't speak immediately. He took a heavy, staggering step forward. "Need carbolic acid." His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, thick with pain. "Bandages, needle, heavy thread." "You need Doc Miller," Cleo corrected, narrowing her eyes. "He's 2 doors down." "No doctor," the man growled, clutching his side. He lifted his head, and Cleo saw his eyes for the first time. They were a piercing, startling shade of pale blue, striking against his weathered, sun-browned skin. There was a wild, desperate intelligence in them. "Doc asks questions. I don't have time for questions." He reached into his heavy coat with a trembling, blood-stained hand and tossed something onto the glass display case. It hit with a heavy, dull clack. Cleo stepped closer. It was a solid gold nugget the size of an unshelled walnut, completely unrefined. "That's for the supplies?" The stranger gasped, his knees buckling slightly. "And for your silence?" Cleo stared at the raw gold, then up at the man. Common sense screamed at her to throw him back into the blizzard, but as a widow who had clawed her way out of the dirt, she recognized a survivor when she saw one. More than that, she saw a vulnerability in his fierce blue eyes that tugged at a rusted, forgotten latch in her chest. "I'm not leaving you to bleed out on my clean floor." Cleo snapped her practical nature, overriding her caution. She let go of the revolver and grabbed him by his good arm. "Come to the back room. Now." He was impossibly heavy, his muscles dense and rigid, but she guided him into the storage room and ordered him onto a low cot she used during late inventory nights. "Take the coat off," she commanded, grabbing a basin and filling it with hot water from the stove. She gathered carbolic acid clean linen and a sewing kit. The man gritted his teeth and shucked the heavy buffalo coat. Beneath it, his flannel shirt was soaked through. It wasn't an animal bite. It was a bullet wound, a clean through and through on his lower left flank, missing the vital organs but bleeding profusely. "You've been shot," Cleo said, flatly soaking a cloth in the hot, stinging acid. "Fell on something sharp," he countered dryly, though a grimace tore across his face. "Unless you fell on a lead ball traveling at high velocity, I suggest you shut up and bite down on this," she said, handing him a clean piece of leather. For the next hour Cleo worked. She had patched up drunks and careless miners before, but this was different. The intimacy of it, her hands pressing firmly against his hot, feverish skin, the rigid discipline of his silence as she stitched the torn flesh sent a strange, unfamiliar jolt through her. She was 47, a woman who considered herself entirely invisible to the desires of men. Yet she found herself acutely aware of the rough texture of his skin and the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. When she finished tying off the thread, she leaned back, wiping sweat from her brow. "You have a steady hand, ma'am," he whispered, his chest heaving. "And you have a thick hide," Cleo replied, wrapping a tight linen bandage around his waist. "Who shot you?" He looked away, staring at the dimly lit ceiling. "Men who want things that don't belong to them." He turned those piercing blue eyes back to her. "I'm Jedediah Boone. Cleo Higgins. I owe you my life, Cleo Higgins." "You owe me the cost of my best linens," she corrected, trying to keep her tone brisk to mask the sudden flutter in her chest. "That gold nugget covers it. You can stay the night until the storm passes, but tomorrow you leave." Jedediah nodded, once his eyes closing. "I'll be gone before you wake." And true to his word, when the grey dawn broke over Oakhaven, the cot was empty. Only the faint smell of pine blood and cold air lingered. Cleo found herself staring at the empty bed, a strange hollow ache in her stomach that she hadn't felt in over a decade. 3 weeks passed. The harsh Colorado winter set in, burying Oakhaven in deep drifts. Cleo locked the gold nugget in a heavy iron lockbox beneath her floorboards, telling no one. Yet despite her routine, her mind betrayed her. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting the towering mountain man to stumble back in. She chided herself for acting like a schoolgirl. "You're 47, Cleo," she would mutter while stocking shelves. He was a drifter with a bullet hole, nothing more. But Oakhaven was changing, and Cleo's sanctuary was under threat. The railroad had announced an expansion, and the proposed track line ran directly behind Cleo's store. Mayor Harrison Caldwell, a slick, ruthless man with pomaded hair and a smile like a snake, had been trying to buy her out for months. On a frigid Tuesday afternoon, Mayor Caldwell stepped into the Mercantile brushing snow from his expensive tailored suit. He was flanked by 2 of his hired men, rough-looking thugs named Virgil and Gideon. "Cleo, my dear," Caldwell said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Still working these long, hard hours. A woman your age shouldn't be pushing herself to an early grave. Cleo didn't stop weighing out sugar. A woman my age knows snake oil when she smells it, Harrison. What do you want? Caldwell's smile tightened. I'm offering you a generous buyout, Cleo. $200 for the deed. It's more than fair. Oak Haven is modernizing. You don't have the capital to keep up. I have the deed, and my answer is still no, Cleo said, staring him down. Caldwell leaned over the counter, his eyes dropping to the ledger. It would be a terrible shame if this old building caught fire in the dead of winter. Or if a widow living alone found herself compromised by the rougher elements of our growing town. Accidents happen, Cleo. It was a direct threat. Cleo's blood ran cold, but her face remained a mask of stone. Get out of my shop, Harrison, Caldwell chuckled softly, signaling to his men. Think on it, Cleo. I won't ask so nicely next time. They left, leaving a toxic chill in the air. Cleo's hands shook as she gripped the counter. She was strong, but she was only one woman against the most powerful man in town. 2 nights later, the bell above the door chimed softly, just as she was extinguishing the oil lamps. Cleo spun around her hand instinctively, flying to her revolver. But the figure in the shadows didn't belong to Caldwell's men. It was Jedediah Boone. He looked healthier. The pallor was gone from his face, and his beard was neatly trimmed. He wore a clean flannel shirt under a heavy wool coat, and he held a rough burlap sack. Jedediah! Cleo breathed her heart, executing a sudden violent leap against her ribs. Told you I owed you, Cleo, he said softly, his deep voice wrapping around her like a warm blanket. He stepped into the light and placed the sack on the counter. From it he pulled 3 flawless thick beaver pelts worth a small fortune. But what caught Cleo's eye was the small object he placed gently beside them, a beautifully hand-carved wooden meadowlark, its wings frozen mid-flight. You didn't have to do this, Cleo said, reaching out to touch the smooth wood of the bird. Wanted to. Jedediah replied, his gaze locked intensely on her face. You saved my life. And you didn't look at me like I was a beast. Cleo looked up, meeting his eyes. I don't judge men by their coats, Jedediah. I judge them by their actions. But you still haven't told me why you were shot. Jedediah's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the window, pulling the curtain shut. 10 years ago down in Denver there was a stagecoach robbery. Gold shipment. A man was killed. I was framed for it by the real thieves forced to run to the mountains. Cleo frowned. Who framed you? A pair of brothers. Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. One of them runs the territory. The other one came out here, changed his last name, and made himself mayor. Cleo gasped. Harrison Caldwell. His real name is Harrison Vance, Jedediah corrected. His men found my camp 3 weeks ago, realized who I was, tried to put a bullet in me to tie up loose ends. That's how I ended up bleeding on your floor. Cleo's mind raced. The mayor was a murderer and a thief, and he wanted her land. Jedediah, Cleo said urgently, stepping around the counter. Caldwell wants this shop. He threatened me 2 days ago. He has men. Before she could finish the sentence, the unmistakable sound of shattering glass exploded from the back storeroom. Cleo jumped, but Jedediah moved with terrifying, predatory speed. He pushed Cleo behind him, drawing a heavy hunting knife from his belt. Heavy boots crunched on the broken glass in the back room. Voices murmured in the dark. Burn it, a voice hissed. It was Virgil Caldwell's hired muscle. Just pour the kerosene. Let the old bat burn with it. Cleo felt a surge of pure fury. Her shop, her life. Jedediah didn't wait. He moved silently into the shadows of the hallway. Cleo heard a sudden violent thud, followed by a choked scream. The sound of a heavy struggle echoed through the wooden beams. Cleo grabbed her Colt revolver and ran toward the doorway. In the dim moonlight pouring through the broken window, she saw Jedediah hoist Virgil by the throat, slamming him brutally into the brick wall. The kerosene can clattered to the floor, spilling its foul-smelling contents. The second man, Gideon, pulled a pistol, but Cleo didn't hesitate. She leveled her Colt and fired. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet shattered the door frame inches from Gideon's head. The thug panicked, dropping his gun and scrambling out the broken window into the snow. Jedediah threw Virgil to the ground, the man groaning in pain, out cold. Jedediah turned to Cleo, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with adrenaline and fierce admiration. "You're a hell of a shot, Cleo Higgins." "I was aiming for his shoulder." Cleo admitted, her hands trembling as she lowered the gun, but their relief was cut violently short. Outside, a flurry of shouts erupted. The gunshot had woken the street. Lanterns flared to life, casting long, frantic shadows against the snow. "Sheriff!" a voice yelled from the boardwalk. It was Caldwell. "They're in the Mercantile. The mountain man is attacking the widow." Cleo's heart dropped into her stomach. It was a setup. Caldwell had sent his men to burn the shop, but hearing the shot, he was twisting the narrative to have the law eliminate Jedediah and take her property all at once. Fists hammered against the front door. "Open up in the name of the law!" shouted Deputy Wyatt. Jedediah looked at Cleo, the wildness returning to his eyes. If they caught him, he would hang for a robbery he didn't commit, and Cleo would be left at Caldwell's mercy. The trap had slammed shut. The heavy fists pounding on the Mercantile's front door threatened to splinter the oak. Cleo's mind raced her pulse, drumming a frantic rhythm against her temples. "The root cellar," Cleo whispered, fiercely grabbing Jedediah's sleeve. "It connects to the old storm drain that empties into the livery alleyway. Move." She didn't wait to see if he followed. Snatching a heavy wool cloak from a peg and shoving her Colt into her coat pocket, Cleo dragged the heavy iron ring of the trapdoor upward. The cellar smelled of damp earth and aging potatoes. As the front door upstairs finally gave way, with a deafening crash, Cleo and Jedediah slipped into the pitch black beneath the floorboards, easing the trapdoor shut, just as heavy boots swarmed the shop above. They waded through the freezing muck of the storm drain, emerging into the biting, howling blizzard of the alley. The cold was an immediate physical blow, but adrenaline kept Cleo's blood running hot. Jedediah whistled sharply, a low cutting sound over the wind. From the shadows of the livery stables, a massive roan stallion trotted forward, its breath pluming in the icy air. "Get up," Jedediah commanded, hoisting Cleo onto the saddle before swinging his massive frame up behind her. He wrapped one arm tightly around her waist, taking the reins with his other hand. "Hold on to me, Cleo." They rode hard into the teeth of the storm, leaving the lantern-lit chaos of Oak Haven behind. For hours they climbed the treacherous switchbacks of Whispering Ridge. The snow was knee-deep on the horse, and the freezing wind threatened to numb Cleo to the bone, but the solid radiating heat of Jedediah's chest pressed against her back kept the frostbite at bay. She had never been this close to a man since Josiah died, yet there was no fear in her heart, only a fierce awakening vitality. Just before dawn, they reached a secluded cabin tucked beneath the sprawling branches of ancient ponderosa pines. Inside, Jedediah quickly stoked a fire in the hearth. The flames cast dancing golden shadows across the rough-hewn log walls. Cleo stood shivering, brushing snow from her cloak. She watched Jedediah move around the cabin, his limp slightly pronounced from the cold. "You can't go back, Cleo," Jedediah said, quietly handing her a tin cup of steaming black coffee. Caldwell will pin the arson on you. He'll say you hired me to kill his men. He holds the judge and the sheriff in his pocket. I'm not running from a thief in a tailored suit. Cleo snapped, her stubborn pride flaring. She took a sip of the bitter coffee, relishing the heat. My life is down there. My shop. Jedediah stepped closer. In the firelight, his pale blue eyes held a vulnerability that stopped Cleo's breath. Your life is wherever you choose to make it. For 10 years I've lived like a ghost on this mountain. But when I was bleeding on your floor, and you looked at me with those fierce eyes, I realized I didn't want to be a ghost anymore. He reached out his calloused, weather-beaten hand, gently tracing the line of her jaw. The touch sent a shockwave through her chest. I am 47 years old, Jedediah. Cleo whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I am hardened. I am tired. I don't have the softness of a young bride. I don't want a young bride. Jedediah murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I want the woman who didn't blink when she stitched up a dying stranger, the woman who stood her ground against a tyrant. He leaned down, and when his lips met hers, there was no hesitation. It wasn't the desperate, clumsy kiss of youth. It was a deep, searing claim between two survivors. Cleo dropped the tin cup, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, pulling him closer as the years of loneliness finally melted away in the warmth of his embrace. Later, as the sun broke over the mountain peaks, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the snow, Jedediah pulled a worn leather saddlebag from beneath the floorboards. We don't have to run, Cleo, he said, pulling out a heavy leather-bound ledger and a weathered tin badge. I told you I was framed. I've spent the last decade tracking down the real evidence. Cleo opened the ledger. It was a meticulous record of bribes, land thefts, and stolen gold shipments, and stamped at the bottom of the most damning page was a seal Cleo recognized. This is an official case file from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Cleo breathed, reading the signature. Agent Charles Siringo. Siringo was tracking the Denver Mint heist, Jedediah explained. He got too close, and Caldwell's men ambushed him. Siringo hid this ledger in a drop point before he died. I found it 2 months ago. It proves Caldwell orchestrated the heist and used the stolen mint gold to buy Oak Haven. That nugget I gave you, it wasn't raw gold. It was a melted-down Denver Mint bar. The federal assay stamp is still visible on the underside. Cleo's eyes widened. If the federal marshals see this, Caldwell hangs. Exactly. Jedediah said, his jaw setting into a hard line. But we have to get it to the territorial capital, and Caldwell knows I have it. That's why he sent his men to burn your shop. He's not going to wait for us to ride out. He's coming here. The distant snap of a twig echoed like a gunshot in the crisp mountain air. Jedediah immediately snuffed the fire. He grabbed his Winchester rifle and pressed his back against the cabin wall, peering through a crack in the heavy wooden shutters. 5 men, Jedediah whispered, jacking a shell into the chamber. Caldwell Deputy Wyatt, and 3 hired guns. They followed the horse tracks before the snow covered them. Cleo didn't panic. She drew her Colt revolver, her hand steady, and moved to the opposite window. We hold the high ground, but we only have so much ammunition. Cleo! Caldwell's slick, venomous voice drifted up from the tree line. Send the mountain man out with the ledger, and I'll let you ride away. Play the grieving widow. It's a role you know so well. Cleo felt a cold fury settle in her stomach. Go to hell, Harrison, she shouted back, her voice ringing off the canyon walls. Burn them out, Caldwell barked. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the thick timber of the cabin, sending wood splinters flying. Jedediah returned fire, the booming crack of his Winchester, dropping one of the hired guns instantly. Cleo took aim through the shutter crack and fired, clipping Deputy Wyatt in the shoulder. The man shrieked and dropped his rifle, crawling desperately behind a snowbank. But Caldwell was relentless. He and his remaining 2 men laid down a punishing barrage of suppressing fire, slowly advancing up the ridge. "They're flanking us," Jedediah growled, reloading his rifle with lightning speed. "I'm going to slip out the back and circle behind them in the timber. Keep them focused on the front." "Be careful," Cleo said, grabbing his arm for a brief, tight squeeze. Jedediah slipped through the rear door, melting into the snowy forest like a phantom. Cleo was left alone. She fired rhythmically, keeping Caldwell and his men pinned down. The smoke from her revolver stung her eyes, and her ears rang from the deafening noise. Suddenly, a heavy thud hit the front door. One of the hired guns had made it to the porch. Before the man could kick the door in, Cleo stepped back, aimed dead center through the wooden panels, and fired twice. A choked gasp sounded from the porch, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the planks. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" A new, booming voice echoed from the base of the ridge. Cleo paused, peering through the smoke. Riding up the trail, flanked by a dozen heavily armed men with silver stars pinned to their dusters, was United States Marshal Thomas Dawson. Caldwell froze his face, draining of color. "Marshal Dawson, thank God you're here. This man—" "Shut your mouth, Caldwell!" Dawson barked, drawing his repeater. From the tree line behind the mayor, Jedediah stepped out, his Winchester leveled directly at the back of Caldwell's head. The tyrant dropped his weapon, raising his hands in defeat. Cleo opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, the cold wind whipping her silver-streaked hair. "How did you know to come?" Cleo asked, her voice carrying over the quieted mountain. Marshal Dawson tipped his hat to her. "We received a telegram 3 days ago from the Oakhaven telegraph operator, ma'am. Said a widow named Cleo Higgins came in demanding to wire the Federal Assay Office about a melted gold bar from the 77 Denver heist. We rode hard from the capital." Cleo looked at Jedediah and offered a sly, breathtaking smile. "I told you I was a practical woman, Jedediah. I never put gold in my lockbox without inspecting it first. I found the mint stamp the day after you left." Jedediah lowered his rifle, a look of profound awe spreading across his rugged face. He walked through the snow, completely ignoring the federal marshals arresting the cursing mayor, and took Cleo gently by the shoulders. "You are a terrifying woman, Cleo Higgins." He whispered, a deep, rumbling laugh vibrating in his chest. "And you are a terrible liar," Cleo replied softly, leaning into his warmth. "You said you'd be gone before I woke up. Yet here you are." Caldwell and his corrupt deputies were hauled away in chains, destined for a federal noose. With the Pinkerton ledger in hand, Jedediah Boone was officially cleared of all charges. The bounty on his head was transformed into a hefty reward for the recovery of the stolen mint gold. A month later, the Oakhaven Mercantile reopened, but the sign above the door had changed. It no longer read Higgins Dry Goods. It was freshly painted with bold, proud letters, Boone and Wife Mercantile. Cleo stood behind the mahogany counter, the heavy gold nugget now fashioned into a beautiful ring resting on her finger. She watched the snow fall outside, feeling a deep, abiding peace. The door chimed, and Jedediah walked in, shaking the snow from his broad shoulders, his blue eyes finding hers with the same fierce, unwavering devotion as the day he crashed into her life. She had given up on love at 47, but the wild, untamed frontier had a funny way of proving a stubborn woman wrong. True love doesn't always arrive on a white horse. Sometimes it crashes through your door bleeding, demanding a second chance at life. Cleo and Jedediah's story proves it's never too late to fight for what's yours. If you were captivated by this tale of wild Western justice and late-in-life romance, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more untold, heart-pounding stories from the untamed frontier.